There is a passage in Aristotle, recorded in the Politics, which says that to live alone is the business of either an animal or a god, never of an ordinary man. Friedrich Nietzsche, in Twilight of the Idols, returned the provocation with a fine cut. He said that the third case was missing. It was necessary to be both things at the same time, and that meant being a philosopher. Henry David Thoreau, in Walden, wrote that he had never found a companion more sociable than solitude itself. 3 voices, 3 centuries, a single claim behind them all. To be truly alone is no trivial condition. It is a slow, rare, painful achievement. And look around you now. The lowered head on the subway, the cold light of the phone illuminating faces at dinner. We live in one of the noisiest eras in history, and yet something essential has shrunk on the inside. Nietzsche made the distinction clear. Solitude is one thing, being abandoned is another. Think for a moment about the most ordinary scene of your week. You're at a restaurant, a cafe, on a bus, and there are bodies all around you. Every head tilted over a screen. Every face lit by the cold light of a phone. The noise of conversations, notifications, short videos scrolling endlessly. And yet, inside this human sea, there's a dry, strange, hard-to-name sensation. Something like hunger, something like thirst. The presence of others has stopped being company. It has become a crowd. And a crowd, as Nietzsche understood before almost anyone else, does not fill. It distracts. The difference between those two things is what separates a life that's lived from a life that's merely gotten through. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, written between 1883 and 1885, Nietzsche described a figure he called the last man. He wasn't a villain, he wasn't a monster, he was worse. He was a comfortable, satisfied creature who had invented small pleasures for the day, small pleasures for the night, and never again looked inside himself. The last man blinks when you speak of greatness. He laughs at the word soul. He has everything except the courage to feel the emptiness that sustains his agitation. And maybe you, reading this, recognize something. Not because you're weak, because the entire world has been designed over the last 2 decades to produce exactly this type of human being on an industrial scale. Every app, every notification, every infinite feed is a machine finely tuned to keep you from being alone with yourself. And whoever is never alone with themselves never becomes anyone at all. The image of the last man is especially disturbing because it isn't a caricature, it's familiar. The last man works, pays the bills, goes out with friends on Saturday, posts the right photo, follows the trendy diet, watches the series the algorithm recommended, sleeps through a night cut up by notifications. Apparently, there's nothing wrong, nothing that could be pointed to. And that is precisely the tragedy Nietzsche saw. The failure of modernity wouldn't be the appearance of monsters. It would be the appearance of a technical and lukewarm humanity, perfectly functional, perfectly entertained, perfectly incapable of making a single deep decision about its own existence. In Zarathustra, he puts a line in the prophet's mouth that hurts. Alas, the time is coming when man will no longer give birth to any star. And the last man, says Nietzsche, will be the one who asks what love is, what creation is, what a star is, and blinks his eyes without understanding. That blinking of the eyes is the characteristic gesture of our time. It is the reflex of someone who has been trained never to face any depth, neither in himself nor in anyone else. There's a distinction that needs to be made right away, because without it, everything that follows falls flat. Being alone and feeling lonely are not the same thing. Nietzsche made that difference clear in more than one passage. Solitude, in the fertile sense of the word, is the experience of being unhooked from the demands of others, in inner silence, in a world where it is finally possible to listen to yourself. Being abandoned, in the painful sense, is the feeling of being invisible, even when surrounded by people. It is imposed disconnection. It is the cold without direction. Chosen solitude strengthens. Involuntary abandonment makes you sick. And the tragic part is that contemporary culture has confused the two things to such a degree that many people flee healthy solitude because they think they're fleeing sick abandonment. They are opposites. One is medicine, the other is a symptom, and no one gets very far without learning to tell them apart. There's a passage in Daybreak, a book Nietzsche published in 1881, that deserves to be read carefully. He wrote that when he's among many, he lives like the many and doesn't think the way he really thinks. That after a while, he feels as if they want to banish him from himself. That's why, he said, he needs the desert in order to become good again. The desert here is not geography. It is a precise metaphor. The desert is anything that clears the noise. It's the long walk without headphones. It's the hour of reading without the phone buzzing beside you. It's the meal eaten slowly with nothing to look at. It's the Saturday when no one needs you. Thoreau, in Walden, the record of the solitary life experiment he conducted between 1845 and 1847 on the shores of a pond in Massachusetts, wrote that he withdrew from the village because he wanted to live deliberately. He wanted to confront only the essential facts of life. And he wanted, at his death, to discover that he had lived, instead of discovering, too late, that he had not lived. These two men, Nietzsche in Sils Maria and Thoreau at Walden, separated by an ocean and by different sensibilities, pointed to the same gesture. Withdraw, cross through, come back changed. But maybe you're thinking right now that these comparisons are unfair, that they were philosophers, and that modern life doesn't allow that kind of retreat. It's an honest objection. It deserves an honest answer. Modern life doesn't require you to spend 40 days in a literal inner retreat. It requires you to refuse to spend 40 minutes without distraction, and that's exactly the refusal almost no one can manage. Take the phone off the table for an hour and watch what happens. The hand starts searching, thoughts race, anxiety rises, not because something important is being missed, because the inner muscle of silence has atrophied, and an atrophied muscle has to be rebuilt slowly, with patience, against the trained reflex of running away. The question that has to come now is why? Why has solitude become so unbearable for so many people? The answer involves a dynamic that operates in silence, and that very few stop to examine. Social interaction, especially in hyper-connected societies, functions as a structure of continuous demand. Every relationship, even the dearest ones, requires something of you. Friends demand attention, presence, listening. Family demands loyalty, a role, conformity to implicit expectations. Partners demand emotional availability. Co-workers demand performance. Strangers on public transportation demand that you not bother them. Followers on social media demand updates, visual presence, cross-validation. All of these demands, added together, form a silent weight that you carry all day long without noticing. At the end of the day, when you finally close the door, there's a tiredness that's hard to explain. It isn't tiredness of the body, it's tiredness of the character. You spent the day being what others needed you to be, and there was no one left to be yourself. Nietzsche grasped this dynamic with unusual clarity. In Beyond Good and Evil, published in 1886, he observed that constant interaction demands sacrifices proportional to the greatness of an individuality. In plain language, that means that the more singular someone is, the heavier the task of living in society becomes. Because society levels, society moderates, society asks you to dull the angles of your personality so you can fit in. And part of modern existential exhaustion comes from exactly that. You aren't tired of life, you're tired of diluted versions of yourself. You're tired of smiling when you'd rather be quiet. You're tired of agreeing when you disagreed. You're tired of showing up when you wanted to disappear. Solitude, the real kind, is the only place where that exhaustion dissolves. Because it's the only place where there is no demand, where you can be without needing to seem. Blaise Pascal, a 17th century French mathematician and philosopher, wrote in his Pensées a sentence that has been repeated for 400 years without losing its precision. He said that all of man's troubles come from a single thing, which is not knowing how to remain quietly in a room. Pascal wasn't being poetic, he was being descriptive. He had observed that human beings, even when they had everything they would need for a happy life, were constantly inventing new reasons to go out, to be distracted, to occupy themselves with anything that would pull their attention away from what was inside. Entertainments, intrigues, aimless trips, useless competitions. All of that, said Pascal, was just flight from the room. Flight from the confrontation with one's own mortality, with one's own emptiness, with one's own postponed questions. And Pascal's point goes further than that and deserves to be developed carefully because it is one of the sharpest observations about the human heart ever recorded. He realized that man doesn't really seek the things he chases. What he seeks, in truth, is the chase itself. Man doesn't want the object, he wants the distraction the object provides. That's why, Pascal wrote, even a king, surrounded by every possible pleasure, becomes miserable when forced to sit with nothing to do. Comfort doesn't cure. Luxury doesn't cure. Only agitation numbed. And that's why agitation has become the dominant form of modern life. Apply that observation to today's world, and the result is surgical. Pascal's silent room has been replaced by the lit-up screen. The old entertainment, which at least required physical movement and some effort, has been replaced by a thumb sliding downward, infinitely, on a feed that never ends. The ability to stay still is extinct in most modern adults. And the troubles, as Pascal predicted, have multiplied in exact proportion to that incapacity. The silent room has become the most feared place in the house, and whoever fears their own room, at bottom, fears themselves. Pascal's observation in the Pensée has yet another layer that usually goes unnoticed. He realized that the search for distraction isn't a moral weakness. It's an existential strategy. Human beings know, on some deep level, that they're going to die, that many of the things they love don't last, that fundamental questions about the meaning of their own existence remain unanswered. That knowledge, if carried head-on, paralyzes. So man invents occupations, small and large occupations that, added together, build a shield against lucidity. Pascal wasn't condemning humanity for that. He was describing, with clinical sympathy, the mechanism that keeps almost everyone functional. But he was also warning. A life crossed only by distractions is a life crossed without being lived. And those who never face the questions never find the answers, not because the answers don't exist, because they only show themselves in silence. Pascal's silent room, translated into today, is the room without a phone, the afternoon without a schedule, the morning without a notification. It is exactly what almost everyone flees from, and it is exactly what almost everyone needs. And here we arrive at a point that needs to be said with as much courage as possible, because it inverts everything the culture teaches. Solitude, well inhabited, is the highest form of freedom there is. Not political freedom, not market freedom, inner freedom. In solitude, and only in solitude, you are free to feel what you feel without needing to justify it. Free to think what you think without needing to defend it. Free to change your mind in the middle of a sentence without needing to explain. Free to cry, to ramble, to laugh out loud at something silly, to stay silent for hours. That freedom is almost unknown to modern man, because modern man is in permanent performance, even when no one is looking. Especially when no one is looking, because he has learned to monitor himself as though he were his own audience. And that's where the tragedy lives. It isn't enough to be alone. You have to turn off the inner camera that keeps broadcasting. Nietzsche had a precise intuition about this. In The Gay Science, he observed that life in society teaches us, from childhood on, to show a face instead of living a face. We learn which expressions are well received, which opinions earn approval, which silences need to be filled. And that learning, repeated over years, stops looking like learning and starts looking like identity. The person becomes confused with the mask they chose, confused to such an extent that when they finally are alone, they continue performing for an imaginary audience. They post, in their head, even when they don't post on the network. They imagine the comment, even in the darkness of the bedroom. They rehearse the well-turned phrase, prepare the next one, prepare the answer to a question no one asked. That inner performance is the hardest addiction to break, because it's invisible. You can be physically alone and mentally in full show mode. Fertile solitude only begins when the inner camera turns off, when you finally stop existing for others inside your own head, and you begin, perhaps for the first time in adult life, to exist for yourself. You might be feeling, at this exact moment, a slight discomfort, a resistance, something that says, well, but I like people, I like my family, I like my friends, and that's true and important. No one here is proposing a monastic flight from the world. The point is something else, and it's more surgical. Without regular periods of fertile solitude, even the best relationships start to rot, because you start entering them as a character, not as a person. You start using others as anesthesia against the silence, and no relationship can hold that weight for very long. Whoever can't be alone with themselves will always turn others into hostages of their own incapacity. They'll demand too much presence, too much attention, too much reassurance. They'll suffocate, and they'll call it love. In Zarathustra, Nietzsche left a sentence that hurts when truly understood. Are you going to your friend? Then you must want to rise above him, not below him. And you can't rise above him if you don't first know how to be with yourself. The friend, like love, is the result of fullness, not of need. And fullness is forged in silence. When that silence finally settles in, something happens. Something that frightens you at first. Because the silence is not empty. The silence is full of things you've spent your whole life avoiding. Thoughts you didn't want to think. Emotions you didn't want to feel. Memories you didn't want to revisit. Frustrations over choices that you pretended were right. Hurts kept in the corner of your throat for so long, they became part of your voice. All of that comes back, rises up. And there lies the real reason, rarely confessed, why modern man flees from silence like someone fleeing a fire. It isn't that he hates being quiet. It's that, being quiet, he meets a tenant he never wanted to greet, himself. And that meeting, even though it is the most important event of adult life, is also the most postponed. People put off the meeting with themselves for decades, and when it finally arrives, it usually comes by force of a crisis, a bereavement, a divorce, an illness, a layoff, something that rips away the external supports and forces them to look at what's left. And what's left, almost always, is someone that person never learned to know. Nietzsche sensed this with a rare honesty among philosophers. In Exe Homo, written in 1888, shortly before the final collapse, he admitted that his entire body of work had been born from his own unhidden pains, that what we repress governs us, that what we face in silence we transform. For him, there was no shortcut. The person who avoids their own depths remains hostage to them. The person who descends, with patience, into their own depths eventually rises carrying something precious. That something is hard to name. It has to do with clarity, with a firmness that isn't faked, with the loss of fear of things that used to paralyze. And that transformation, it bears repeating, only happens in withdrawal. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche left one of the most quoted sentences in all his work. He who fights monsters should see to it that he does not become a monster himself. And when you gaze long into the abyss also gazes into you. That sentence, repeated out of context, has become a t-shirt quote. But in the original context, it carries a practical warning. Nietzsche was talking about what happens to someone who faces their own interior for long enough. The abyss appears. The things you spent years pretending not to see appear. And the abyss, looked at directly, returns the gaze. That frightens you. But it is also the gateway to any real transformation. Whoever never faces their own abyss lives an entire life sliding across the surface of themselves. Whoever faces it and crosses through discovers that the feared monster was, in large part, the shadow of fear. There is, yes, real pain in there. But pain looked at head-on is smaller than pain hidden in the corner of the chest for decades. Solitude, seen this way, stops being a threat and becomes a condition for the most postponed encounter of all. The encounter with what is called for lack of a better word, oneself. There is a path within Nietzsche's work that describes exactly this journey of inner transformation. It's in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. In the allegory, he called the three metamorphoses of the spirit. The first metamorphosis is the camel. The camel is the spirit that carries. It carries traditions, inherited values, family expectations, religious dogmas, cultural patterns, the opinions of others. The camel is strong. It bears weight, but the weight isn't its own. It's borrowed. The camel spends its life crossing the desert carrying baggage that others placed on its back. You might be, right now, exactly a camel. The camel is the weight you feel on your shoulders when you open your email on a Sunday night. It's the line at the bank, the meeting scheduled for 7 in the morning, the inherited obligation to keep up appearances for relatives you barely know. It's the to-do list that grows faster than you can knock it down, and yet you get up every day to face it, without ever asking whether it's yours. Nietzsche described the camel as the one who asks what is the heaviest thing to bear, and then carries it. There is heroism in this phase, even virtue, but it is a blind virtue. Whoever remains a camel, their whole life dies exhausted without ever having asked whether the load made sense. The second metamorphosis happens in withdrawal, and not by accident. It is in the desert, in silence, in chosen solitude, that the camel transforms into a lion. The lion is the spirit that says no, that questions, that tears off the weights it didn't choose. The lion doesn't create values yet, but it refuses the false ones. It says no to blind duty, no to obedience without reflection, no to inherited narratives that suffocate inner life. Nietzsche says, the lion must face a great dragon, and that dragon is called thou shalt. On every scale of the dragon glitters a millennia-old value, a centuries-old commandment. The lion, in order to create freedom, must roar against those scales. The lion is the first time you turned off the phone on a weekend and nobody died. It's the first time you said no to a family request without feeling like a traitor for the rest of the year. It's the first time you looked at a career demand and realized it came from outside, and that getting out of it was possible. The lion is the phase of legitimate anger, of intelligent revolt, of dismantling the old lies. And that phase no doubt requires prolonged solitude. You're not going to become a lion in the middle of the crowd that applauds the camel. You need the inner retreat, the screen-free hour, the long walk, the uncomfortable silence. That's where the inner voice grows loud enough to disagree with the external voices. That's where the no is born. And without that no subsequent yes has any real value. But it's also necessary to say what Nietzsche doesn't make explicit, and what many hasty readers miss. The lion is a phase, not a destination. To remain a lion your whole life is just as limiting as remaining a camel. There's a type of adult, especially in contemporary culture, who discovered the raw, discovered revolt, discovered the deconstruction of traditions, and stopped there. He becomes a professional critic of everything, says no to everything, finds fault with anything, confuses lucidity with bitterness. That eternal lion is a sad figure, because he gained negative freedom, the freedom to refuse, but never reached positive freedom, which is the freedom to create. Nietzsche knew about this risk. That's why he wrote, in the same passage of Zarathustra, that the lion must still become a child. Without that third passage, the path stays halfway. And being halfway on any inner journey is not half success. It is stable frustration, disguised as maturity. The third metamorphosis is the child. And this is where many people get stuck in the reading, because it seems like a regression, but it isn't. Nietzsche chose the child as the symbol of the highest form of the spirit because the child is capable of creating out of nothing, of inventing worlds, of playing as if for the first time. The child doesn't carry like the camel, doesn't refuse like the lion. The child creates their own values, creates their own meaning, creates themselves. He describes the child in Zarathustra as innocence and forgetting, a new beginning, a game, a self-propelled wheel, a sacred yes. The child is the gesture of someone who draws without asking what it's for. It's the morning you wake up, And for the first time in years, know that you chose the day instead of being chosen by it. That is the final goal of the inner journey, according to Nietzsche. To become who you are, an expression he adopted as a motto and used as the subtitle of Exe Homo. To become who you are doesn't mean discovering a ready-made essence buried somewhere deep inside. It means building an entire existence, choice by choice, value by value, gesture by gesture, out of the silent raw material that only appears in true solitude. And that construction doesn't happen in the herd. It happens in the silent crossing. And here there's a practical observation that has to be made, because without it, all of this can sound abstract. Creating your own values doesn't mean inventing extravagant moralities. It doesn't mean turning against every custom of your culture. It means, first of all, separating what is yours from what was merely absorbed. It means looking at your convictions about money, about family, about success, about love, about shame, and asking honestly, did this come from me or was it installed in me? That exercise, simple in description and incredibly difficult in practice, is one of the most transformative there is. Because most people discover, when they do it sincerely, that they carry as absolute truth a whole series of convictions that were never chosen. Convictions inherited from parents, from schools, from institutions, from teenage friends, from algorithms. Convictions that just stuck, like stickers slapped on the skin and forgotten there. Peeling them off, one by one, takes patience and silence. But the result is a life in which you finally recognize, in the mirror, someone who chose what they think, instead of someone who only repeats what they heard. In On the Genealogy of Morality, from 1887, Nietzsche showed that most of what each of us calls morality is, in truth, habit made invisible by time. Making visible what has become invisible, and reviewing it in the light of your own reason, is the work of adult maturity. And that work, it bears repeating, can only be done alone. There is a central concept in Nietzsche's thought that needs to enter here without distortion. It is the concept of the will to power. It appears in various texts of his maturity, especially in posthumous fragments, and for a long time it was badly misunderstood. The will to power is not the desire for power over others. It is not the will to dominate, command, control. Nietzsche was not proposing a manual for tyranny. The will to power, in the more careful reading, is the inner creative force that drives every living being to surpass itself. It is what makes a plant grow toward the light, what makes the artist redo a work 10 times in search of a better form, what makes a person, after a fall, get up and try again. The will to power is life in ascending motion, and it has one decisive characteristic. It is not born in noise, it is born in silence. Every great work, every real transformation, every decision that changed a life sprouted from periods of withdrawal, not from periods of agitation. Human greatness, in any area, demands inhabited solitude. And the spectator who flees from silence, without realizing it, also flees from his own creative capacity, which lives inside him, waiting for enough silence to manifest. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche described the will to power as the fundamental instinct of every living form, not the instinct of survival, as many before him had thought, but the instinct of growth, of expansion, of affirmation. To survive, he observed, is easy. Anything survives, given the minimum circumstance. The hard part is to grow. The hard part is to overcome yourself, day after day, against the inertia of comfort and against the weight of other people's opinions. And that is exactly what fertile solitude unlocks. When you stay alone with yourself for long enough, without distraction, without performance, without needing to please, the inner will to power begins to manifest. It appears as a clear desire to do something specific that had been buried for years under other priorities. It appears as a desire to learn something, to create something, to change something. It isn't a whim. It is your life asking for its own direction. But that voice only speaks at a low volume. That's why the noisy world drowns it out. That's why chosen silence is so necessary. It is in silence that the voice of your own will is finally able to be heard. But there is a path, and it has already been mapped out, with almost surgical precision, by a man who spent his entire life testing it on himself. There is a moment within this journey when something curious happens. The person, after months or years of practicing fertile solitude, begins to feel something strange about their own history. Instead of wanting to change everything that happened, they begin to accept. Not in the cowardly, conformist sense. They accept in the Nietzschean sense, which is the concept of amor fati. In The Gay Science, a book from 1882, Nietzsche presented this concept memorably. "I want to learn more and more, to see as beautiful what is necessary in things," he wrote. "I want to be one of those who say yes." Years later, in Ecce Homo, he picked up the theme again with an even more radical formulation. "My formula for human greatness is amor fati, love of fate. Not to want anything to be different, not in the past, not in the future, not in eternity, not merely to bear what is necessary, but to love it." At first glance, this sounds like an easy line, almost a refrigerator magnet. But what Nietzsche was saying is harder. He was saying that inner maturity arrives when the person stops fighting with what happened, including with what hurt, including with what seemed unfair, and starts to see all of it as the raw material of who they are today. Applied to solitude, that means stopping treating the solitary phase as a failure. Stop asking yourself why you still don't have a relationship, why you still don't have the perfect group of friends, why you're going through a season when the phone rings hardly at all. Instead of being an enemy, solitude becomes a teacher. Instead of a problem, an opportunity. And that inner turn changes the flavor of everything. The same hour that used to feel heavy becomes fertile. The same empty night becomes a full night. Not because the circumstance changed, because the inner gaze changed. That's what amor fati is. It is loving the soil you were born on, even if it's stone. Because it is in that soil, and in no other, that the person you can still become will sprout. Nietzsche went even further and connected this concept to what he called eternal recurrence, an experimental idea he presented in The Gay Science. Imagine, he proposed, that everything you have lived would repeat itself an infinite number of times, exactly the same, without any change. Every pain, every shame, every loss. Would you have the courage to say yes to that repetition? Whoever can say yes, that person has crossed over. Whoever still trembles at the question still has inner work to do. And all of that work, from beginning to end, requires withdrawal. The eternal recurrence was not, for Nietzsche, a cosmological doctrine. It was an inner test, a criterion for measuring how true the life you've been living really is. Because most people, if they actually stopped to imagine the infinite repetition of their own days, would be horrified. Not because the days are catastrophic, but because they're empty. Because they were put together by others, chosen without choice, gotten through on autopilot. Repeating that life an infinite number of times feels unbearable precisely because deep down it was barely lived even once with real presence. The eternal recurrence turns that realization into a motor. If you couldn't bear to repeat what you're doing today, then today has to change. Not tomorrow, today. The question of the eternal recurrence is the question of urgency. And that question, like practically everything in Nietzsche, can only be answered in silence. In a crowd, it disappears into the noise. Alone with yourself, it burns until the answer appears. And when it appears, it usually comes in the form of a small, practical, immediate decision. Change 1 hour of the day, cut a habit, call someone, stop calling someone else. Small rearrangements that, added together, transform life into something that would be worth living again, and again, and again. The moment comes when theory has to turn into practice, because without practice, philosophy becomes ornament, and ornament doesn't change lives. So here are some concrete directions, anchored in the habits of the thinkers themselves that we've followed along the way. The first direction is establishing a daily time of screen-free silence. It doesn't have to be much at the start. It can be an hour. An hour when the phone stays in another room. No music, no podcast, No television in the background, just you and whatever shows up. It can be slow reading. It can be a walk without headphones. It can simply be sitting at the table and looking out the window. What matters is the intentional absence of external stimulus. At first, this is going to feel impossible. The hand will reach for the phone by itself. Thoughts will flee toward lists, plans, practical problems. That's okay. Keep going. The inner muscle of silence is like any other. It atrophies with the use of distraction, but it can be rebuilt. And it gets rebuilt exactly like this. Sitting, waiting, crossing through the initial boredom, which is the gateway to something much larger. The second direction is the long walk, alone. Nietzsche walked for hours around Sils Maria in Switzerland, where he wrote much of his mature work. He said, in more than one letter, that the true thoughts came while walking, not while sitting. There is something about the continuous motion of the body combined with the absence of company that unlocks thinking in a way no other activity manages. Ancient philosophers were already practicing this centuries ago, walking around colonnades while discussing ideas, and the philosophical tradition of walking has run through all of Western history. But you don't need tradition. You need a street, a park, a trail, a whole neighborhood to cross. And you need to do it slowly, without an urgent destination, without a phone buzzing in your pocket. 30 minutes daily, or one long walk a week, can rearrange internally things that 10 sessions of any other practice can't. Not because the walk is a miracle, because it creates in the body the conditions that free thought requires. Nietzsche had a memorable line about this. Distrust any thought that was conceived sitting down. It was an exaggeration, of course, but an exaggeration with a kernel of truth. Thoughts thought while sitting tend to be administrative thoughts. Thoughts thought while walking, more often, are the transformative ones. The third direction is the journal. And here you have to be careful, because there's a wrong way to keep a journal, a way that has become common on social media. The monument journal, in which the person records events as if they were building a portfolio. That's not the journal we're talking about. The fertile journal is messy, ugly, repetitive, contradictory. You write what you're feeling, without editing for anyone. You write what you discovered about yourself in the last few hours. You write a question without answering it. You come back the next day and contradict what you wrote. That exercise trains something essential. It trains the inner ear. It trains the capacity to listen to what you yourself are thinking. Because most people don't think, they react, and reaction is not thought. Thought requires time, requires space, requires the patience to see an idea through to the end. The journal is the workshop where that skill is forged. The fourth direction is slow, deep reading of dense books. Not voracious reading of summaries. Not short excerpts from social media. Whole books, read calmly, annotated, revisited. There is a qualitative difference between reading 30 posts on a social network and reading 30 pages of a single solid book. The first activity fragments attention. The second rebuilds it. And rebuilt attention is practically a superpower in today's world because almost no one has it anymore. Nietzsche's own books, and Zarathustra in particular, were written to be ruminated on, not consumed. He said, in the preface to On the Genealogy of Morality, that his writing required a ruminating reader, a reader who chews, comes back, rereads, lets things settle. It's in that rumination that something shifts in the reader, not because he learns new information, because he learns a new rhythm of thinking. The fifth direction is the meal in silence. It might seem like a detail, but it isn't. Most people today eat with some parallel stimulus. Television, a video on the phone, conversation, social media. Eating in silence, slowly, paying attention to the flavor, the texture, the body receiving food, is one of the simplest and most profound practices of presence there is. Eating with presence teaches the body to be where it is. And a body that learns to be where it is teaches the mind. Try, for 1 week, having at least one meal a day in total silence. You'll notice things you'd never noticed before. You'll notice you were eating too fast. You'll notice you barely tasted anything. You'll notice that the act of eating, which takes up hours of life every week, had become a blind interlude between tasks. Recovering that attention is starting to recover your life. It is the practical application of what Thoreau called, in Walden, living deliberately. Being where you are, doing what you're doing, feeling what you're feeling, instead of moving through existence as if it were a hallway to somewhere else that never arrives. It's worth lingering for a moment on that expression of Thoreau's, because it's decisive. To live deliberately means, in essence, to stop living on autopilot. It means that every small act of the day, even the acts repeated for years, even the ones that seem trivial, receives the attention of someone who is actually there. Thoreau wrote in Walden that the mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation, and that this desperation comes precisely from the absence of deliberation. People move through jobs, marriages, friendships, entire years, without ever consciously deciding what they are doing. They just react. They just keep going. And the end of that road is bitter, because life didn't wait. To live deliberately is the opposite of that. It is choosing, even in small choices, choosing breakfast with presence, choosing the conversation with your child with presence, choosing the route home with presence. That deliberation, repeated, becomes a habit, and the habit of presence over the years becomes an entire existence. But it can only be built by someone who has had time, alone, to discover what they really consider important. Without solitude, there is no deliberation. Without deliberation, there is no life of one's own. Only life moved through. The sixth direction, and maybe the hardest, is what could be called an approval fast. For defined periods, give up the search for validation. Don't post. Don't tell anyone what you're doing. Don't share the accomplishment, the beautiful thought, the book you're reading. Just live. Just think. Just exist, without an audience. For most people today, that is almost unbearable at first, because the current economy of subjectivity is structured in validation cycles. I do something, I show it, I receive confirmation, I feel that I exist. Cutting that cycle is uncomfortable, but it is also liberating, because it forces you to develop an inner source of confirmation, a capacity to know that something is worthwhile in itself, regardless of the number of likes. That capacity, once developed, changes everything. Decisions stop being remote-controlled by the imagined gaze of others. Life starts to have an inner center of gravity, and it is from that inner center that real strength flows. Everything else is theater. These practices, added together, form a regimen. Not a severe regimen, but a delicate, consistent, patient one. The effect of that regimen, over time, is a visible transformation. The person starts moving through the world differently. They speak less, but what they say carries more weight. They decide more slowly, but their decisions go wrong less often. They care less about approval, but they are more loved by the people who matter. They tire less in social interactions because they enter them whole, without using the other person as a crutch. They read better, listen better, sleep better, not by magic, but by the simple fact that they have come back to being with themselves. And whoever is with themselves is with everything. Whoever runs from themselves runs even inside a crowd. In the preface to Ecce Homo, the autobiographical book of 1888, Nietzsche summed up the heart of all his work in a formula: how one becomes what one is. Note the verb, to become, not to discover, not to reveal, to become. For Nietzsche, there was no ready-made essence waiting to be dug up at the bottom of the soul. There was human material being continuously formed by choices, by habits, by circumstances, and above all, by the person's degree of honesty with themselves. To become who you are is a process, a crossing, a forge. And that forge only works at a specific temperature, the temperature of fertile solitude. Without it, the forge goes cold. Without it, the person ends up shaped by others, by the trends of the moment, by algorithms, by fears, by inheritances, by automatic habits. They become what happened instead of choosing what they are. The closing of Thus Spoke. Zarathustra brings an image worth attention. The prophet Zarathustra, after 10 years of solitude in the mountains, decides to come down. Not because he grew tired of solitude, because solitude had transformed him into someone who had something to offer the world. Solitude, for Nietzsche, was never a final destination. It was a crossing. It was in withdrawal that substance was forged. It was in the descent that this substance was given over. That movement of climbing your own mountain and then coming down for the company of others is the correct rhythm of a full human existence. Whoever only climbs becomes an embittered hermit. Whoever only comes down becomes part of the herd. The full life requires both movements, withdrawal and giving, silence and word, solitude and company. And the secret, which contemporary culture has lost, is that the first movement qualifies the second. Without solitude, company becomes sick. Without silence, the word becomes empty. Without a mountain, there is no descent worth taking. You have to climb. You have to cross your own desert. There's something few people confess, but many feel about the inner state of the world today. A diffuse sense that we are living, but we aren't exactly being. As if life were happening on a parallel plane, and we were watching it from outside. The Greeks had a name for this state. They called it acedia, a form of weariness of the soul. The medieval monks feared it as the noonday demon, that torpor that appeared in the hottest hours and made the monk give up on everything. It's the feeling of being outside your own center, of living on the surface. And that feeling, observed up close, almost always has the same origin. The person has stopped visiting their own interior. They've traded depth for speed. They've traded silence for connection. They've traded solitude for the public curation of themselves. And the soul, which keeps existing in spite of everything, protests. The protest comes as tiredness for no reason, as vague sadness, as the feeling that something is missing without knowing what, and something is missing. What's missing is exactly what was outsourced. What's missing is time with yourself. What's missing is chosen silence. What's missing is the forge. Nietzsche had his own name for this state, and he developed it powerfully in On the Genealogy of Morality. He called it passive nihilism. Passive nihilism is the condition of someone who no longer believes in anything, but doesn't have the courage to create anything new in its place either. They live by inertia. They do what is expected of them, but without faith. They go to work, go to the party, post the picture, and inside, something has stayed switched off. Nietzsche saw this as modernity's greatest danger. Not declared atheism, not the formal loss of religion, but that grey apathy that settled in where meaning used to be. And the remedy he proposed was not to go back to the old certainties. It was to cross through the emptiness and, on the other side, create your own values. But creating your own values is work that no one does on the autopilot of collective life. It requires stopping. It requires distance. It requires the difficult, sometimes solitary, temperature in which real decisions are made. Passive nihilism is cured by inner presence. An inner presence is rebuilt in silence. There is no shortcut. There never was. The good news, and maybe the only news that matters, is that this emptiness can be filled. Not tomorrow, not next week, today, tonight. You can, after watching this video, leave the phone in another room, sit down, do nothing for 30 minutes, just stay, listen to whatever comes up, endure the initial boredom, cross through the discomfort. You can, on the weekend, go out for a long walk without headphones, without music, without anything besides the sound of your steps and your thoughts. You can buy a cheap notebook, any notebook, and start writing, in any order, anything you're feeling. You can pick a dense book, one of those you've always avoided, and read 10 pages a day, calmly, underlining, going back, ruminating. You can have a meal in silence. You can, for 1 week, not post anything on social media. You can, instead of looking for another podcast to fill the commute to work, simply listen to the silence of the route. Each of these gestures, small on its own, joins the others to form a practice. And practice, over time, becomes character. And character, over time, becomes destiny. That, at bottom, is all of Nietzsche's teaching translated into a single sentence. You don't become strong by thinking about being strong. You become strong by doing the things only a strong person would do. And being alone with yourself, in an era that trains everyone to flee from that, is one of the bravest things still left. There is, at bottom, a silent question every viewer of this video carries, even without consciously formulating it. Is it worth it? Is it worth facing all of this? Is it worth going through the initial discomfort, crossing the boredom, facing the buried emotions, giving up the comfort of permanent distraction? And the answer, after everything that's been said, can only be one. It is. It's worth it because the price of not doing it is greater. The price of not doing it is living from 20 to 70 years old, as the character of a narrative someone else wrote. It is reaching the end of life and discovering, in a terrible flash and too late, that there was a possible life beneath the life you lived, and that it was never touched because there was never enough silence to hear it. That risk is real. It is the statistical fate of the majority, and the only way out is the oldest path in human history, the same path that Aristotle glimpsed, that Pascal recommended in his Pensées, that Thoreau tested at Walden, that Nietzsche turned into art from the beginning to the end of his work. The path of solitude inhabited with courage. You will come back from the desert different. You won't come back immune to the world. You won't come back without fear. You won't come back perfect. You'll come back harder to manipulate, more able to choose, more lucid about what matters. You'll come back as the author of your own life. And being an author, in a whole culture organized to produce characters in bulk, is the rarest form of life still left. That is the invitation Nietzsche extended, that Aristotle glimpsed, that Pascal recommended in his Pensées, and that Thoreau tested in person on the shores of the pond. It isn't a comfortable invitation, but it is perhaps the only invitation still worth accepting. If something in this video reached you and you're thinking right now about starting that crossing, leave a like down below. It's a small gesture, but it helps this channel a lot to keep producing content that respects the intelligence of those who watch. Subscribe to the channel if you aren't subscribed yet, because here we treat philosophy as what it has always been, a tool for living better, not an intellectual ornament. And if you want to go deeper, if you felt that these ideas need to become a daily practice in your life, join our members club through the link in the description. Inside, we develop these themes in depth with exercises, guided readings, and a community of people who are making this crossing alongside you. Solitude doesn't have to be lonely. It can be shared by those who understand its value. I'll see you on the other side.